Well, good evening, class, or morning, or whatever time you happen to be watching this. It's currently 4:12 for me on a Tuesday. I don't know about you guys, but days seem to be kind of running together for me. This is for the week of April. Oh, golly gee. Want to make sure I have this right. The week of April 6th. So, our next topic is the Jacksonian era. And honestly, you're going to see a whole lot of my personal bias in this particular section because I do not like Andrew Jackson at all. Now, so I think it's very important that we recognize our personal biases and actually mention it whenever we can. So, kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. Basically, I see this as two videos today, three possibly, as I am trying to kind of keep them around 35, 39, 35, 40 minutes each. Um, that seems like a better digestible part. What our first video is going to be about, before we get to Andrew Jackson, is I like to always do a special lecture about Henry Clay. Now, this was always a big topic when I taught Kentucky history because he was Kentuckian. Not a born Kentuckian, but, a transplant. And he did a lot of great things while representing Kentucky. Now, you might ask, why am I talking about Henry Clay in the Jacksonian era? Well, I mentioned before, I think, either on the last video or just sometime when we were talking, that Andrew Jackson, you know, is important. The era is named after him, but Henry Clay was also there. In fact, Henry Clay really outlasts Andrew Jackson in a lot of ways. And I would argue that Henry Clay has just as much or more of an impact on American history than Andrew Jackson. So I think it's very kind of important to take a look at his life. So, a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about definitely is not in your book, so you'll want to pay attention. One of your essays for our final will actually be about Henry Clay, so might be good to kind of pay attention. So, Henry Clay, born 1777, dies 1852. He was a lawyer, a politician, and one of the greatest orators of the day. He will serve in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. He will three times be the Speaker of the House, the 8th, 10th, and 13th Congress. On his very first day in Congress, in that 8th Congress, he was named Speaker of the House. He was a member and, quite frankly, a founding member, I think, of the Whig Party. He will serve as Secretary of State. He will be known as the Great Compromiser for the Missouri Compromise of 1819 or 1820, and for, most importantly, the Compromise of 1850, which probably put off the Civil War for 50 years. He was also called Henry of the West. He was a slaveholder who favored emancipation and colonization. Uh, Henry Clay was kind of a giant to a lot of people. Abraham Lincoln idolized him, called Henry Clay a beau statesman. In fact, Lincoln will actually give one of the eulogies at one of Henry Clay's funerals. In 1956, he was named as one of the 5 greatest senators in American history. So let's get into this man's life. He's born April 12th, 1777, in Hanover, Virginia. His father owned 22 slaves. He was a member of the planters class. Henry was the 7th of 9 children. His parents were the Reverend John Clay and Elizabeth Hudson Clay. Henry's father dies in 1781. Henry's and his brothers were each left 2 slaves apiece. The daughters didn't get anything. The mother soon remarried a man named Captain Henry Watkins. You kind of had to back then. You really couldn't make it kind of on your own as a woman, especially as a single mom. He moved Henry Watkins, moved the family to Richmond, Virginia. There, Henry Clay got a job as a shop assistant. Soon, Watkins got him a job in the office of the Court of the Chancery, where he learned the law. He became friends with and then lawyers for and secretary for a man named George Wythe, who was very important in Virginia politics. Later, he will take a position with the Virginia Attorney General, a man named Robert Brock. Without formal training, Clay studied for and passed the bar. See, so if you want to be a lawyer, forget law school, just study. It'll work out fine for you. No, I'm just kidding. You probably won't. He was admitted to practice law in 1797. In November of 1797, he relocates to Lexington, Kentucky to be closer to his family, where he will gain a good reputation as a lawyer. Sometimes he will be paid in land. At one point in Lexington, he will own 2 town lots, the Kentucky Hotel. By 1812, he owned a 600-acre plantation he called Ashland. If you're ever in Lexington, Kentucky, you can actually visit Ashland. It's a very interesting place. One of his clients will be his future father-in-law, Thomas Hart. He must have done pretty well. Perhaps his most notable client was Aaron Burr in 1806, who he defended successfully, but was angry about it later because he said that Burr had basically looked him in the eye and lied. Now, one reason he was angry is because it was probably politically bad to have her helped Aaron Burr. He will marry Lucretia Hart on April 11, 1759. They will have, 1799, 1799. Big difference, not a time traveler. He will have 11 children, 6 daughters, all of whom will die before they reach adulthood, and 5 sons. A total of 7 children of his will die before he does. Henry Clay Jr. will be killed in the Mexican-American War. Lucretia will die in 1864. Before we talk about his political career, I do want to talk about probably his other most famous client was his cousin Cassius Clay, not the boxer, but that is who Muhammad Ali is actually named after. Cassius is an extremely interesting figure. In fact, I'll try to find a video to include about Cassius because he's pretty cool. He was a straight-up abolitionist. He wanted to abolish slavery completely, which is very unpopular where he was living in Kentucky. He will be the editor of a newspaper. One time he actually defended said newspaper with a cannon. Now, probably the most unique thing about him is he didn't like guns too much. He preferred to use knives. In fact, if you Google him and a knife fighting guide, you'll find the fighting guide that he actually wrote. He said the key was to thrust up. Anyway, he was on trial for attempted murder. What happened was he was giving an abolitionist speech. Someone didn't like it, so someone was in the crowd. They were pulling out their gun. At the same time, Cassius was pulling out his knife out of his scabbard. He pulls the scabbard up. The bullet actually hits the scabbard and bounces off. So then Cassius proceeds to attack the man and cut him up pretty badly. He was then arrested, and Henry Clay's final basically defense was, this is a man, he was defending himself. Would you expect a Kentuckian to do any less? So Cassius Clay was a very interesting figure. Wish we could have more time talking about it. But like I said, I'll try to include a little biographical video about him if I can find it one. Fascinating man. Now let's get back to Henry. In 1803, He served as a representative from Fayette County to the Kentucky General Assembly, where he wanted to liberally interpret the Kentucky Constitution. He wanted to push Kentucky toward gradual emancipation, and he wanted to move the state capital to Lexington. In 1804, he'll still be practicing law. He will defend the Kentucky Insurance Company. In 1806, he will be named to the U.S. Senate to replace John Breckinridge, who will be a very important figure later. He was sworn in on December 29th, 1806. He will serve less than a year, just kind of finishing up a term. In fact, a lot of people saw a Senate term as kind of a flexible, move around kind of job at the time. Technically, he was too young to be a senator, but no one actually seemed to notice. He returned to Kentucky in 1807 and was elected Speaker of the State House. He introduced a bill that said members should only wear homespun clothes. This angered another man in the assembly named Humphrey Marshall. They almost fought a duel right then and there. Clay challenged him to a duel. On January 9th, 1809, a duel was held. Clay grazed Marshall, and Clay was hit in the thigh. In 1810, he goes back to the U.S. Senate. In the summer of 1811, he is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. As I mentioned, he will be chosen Speaker the very first day. Will be re-elected 5 times. Basically, what he did is he didn't just show up the first day. He went early and he kind of smoothed people. Really good at that. The Clay will actually turn the speakership into the powerful office it is today. Before Clay, basically, the speaker was a parliamentarian who just kind of ruled on things. Now Clay is going to be the one who decides who serves on what committee. He places a majority of his faction on committees, and therefore he runs the House. And that's kind of how it is today. In fact, the speakership is so important, it's third in line for the presidency. All of that thanks to Henry Clay. Originally, he opposed the National Bank, which will be very important later. He was a member of the War Hawks that pushed for the War of 1812. He will serve as a peace commissioner at Ghent in 1814. In 1815, he will negotiate a commerce treaty with Britain. In 1816, he will establish the American Colonization Society. This was actually something Lincoln was really big into as well. What Clay wanted to do is he wanted to raise money. He wanted to, as soon as slaves were free, basically put them on a boat and send them to Africa. We actually set up a colony called Liberia. One of the states there is actually called Clay Ashland. And Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln and others kind of thought that would be the best way to kind of solve the racial problem that would kind of come up. Now, it never was very feasible. Logistically, it is impossible to remove millions of people. Wouldn't be enough money. And plus, we're talking about people who have never actually been to Africa. Africa is not their home. The United States is their home. So it just didn't quite work. Henry Clay will believe in something called the American system, which we'll see during John Quincy Adams' term when we talk about the Jacksonian era. Basically, what Clay saw was that there's a lot of regional tension in the United States. And part of the goal of the American system was to make each region interdependent on the other regions in the country. That way they would come together. And to do this, he wanted the government to spend money on like infrastructure, things like that. He will help pass a tariff in 1818, which was opposed by Andrew Jackson. He will also be a strong supporter of independence in Latin America. In fact, there are more statues of Henry Clay in Latin America than there are in this country. He also supported Greek independence. He will, as I mentioned, broker the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise, I'll talk a little bit more in the next video, but basically it created the north-south Mason-Dixon line where states north of that line, except for Missouri, would be free. States below that line would have slavery, basically, was the compromise they came to in order to keep the number of free and slave states essentially the same. In 1824, Henry Clay will run for president, and this was a huge election. There were four major candidates: Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, Andrew Jackson, and a man named William Crawford. Well, as you can imagine, a four-way race in the Electoral College did not result in a victor. Remember, you have to have a majority of the Electoral College vote to become president. If you don't, it's going to be decided by the House of Representatives. Well, here's how it worked out. Andrew Jackson had 99 votes. John Quincy Adams had 84. Crawford had 47. Clay came in last with 37. Excuse me, Crawford had 41. Clay came in last with 37, so it went to the House. Now, Clay is not going to become president, but he is the man who can arrange the votes in the House of Representatives to determine who would become president. Now, he will be accused of what is called a corrupt bargain. That's going to what Andrew Jackson is going to call it. But the truth of the matter is there is no evidence that anything corrupt kind of went on, and it's a situation where Henry Clay probably did what he thought was best. Now, he didn't really have any love for John Quincy Adams. So, and he also had to defy his own state. Kentucky sent word to him that said, man, obviously we want you to be president, but if you can't be president, we would like you to support a candidate from the West. And in that case, that would be Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. Henry Clay's response was basically, oh, hell no, you're not telling me what to do. If I was a senator, maybe you could tell me what to do because you appoint me. But I was elected by the people, and I'm going to do what I want to do. So he's got a choice to make. Now, he doesn't like Andrew Jackson like at all. They are mortal enemies. So there's no way he's going to support Andrew Jackson. He doesn't like the fact he's a general, a braggart. There's just nothing about the man he likes. Well, William Crawford, a lot of people didn't know this, he had suffered a stroke while all this was going on. He couldn't speak. Though I suppose that might not be such a bad quality in a president these days, right? So reluctantly, really, John Quincy Adams became kind of his only choice. Now, what happens is Adams wins the election. Henry Clay is then named Secretary of State, so they call it the corrupt bargain. So what happens there is 1824, Clay will serve, 1825. Clay serves as Secretary of State, does some notable things. Supports John Quincy Adams for re-election in 1828. He is absolutely destroyed by Andrew Jackson in basically a two-man race. In 1832, while Jackson is president, Henry Clay will help deal with the nullification crisis, which we'll talk about in the next video. In 1832, Clay is picked to run again for president as a Whig. Clay loses badly, even though he thought he could beat Jackson. And we're going to talk more about that campaign specifically in the next video. In 1840, Clay wanted to run again, but instead the Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison, who will go on to win, and he will die and be replaced by John Tyler. Harrison's the one that spoke too long, got pneumonia. The problem with Tyler was he really wasn't a Whig. He was really a anti-Jackson Democrat, so he didn't really get along with anyone. Clay will try to dominate the Tyler administration, but it didn't really work. 1844 comes along. Henry Clay runs again. This is actually a really kind of interesting election. He thought, and again, we're going to really end this with the Jackson video, Jacksonian era video net. He thought he was going to run against Martin Van Buren, They had agreed that they wouldn't talk about things like slavery because it's a bad issue for both of them. I'll explain in the next video why it was bad for Van Buren. Um, but the Democrats threw a curveball and they nominated James K. Polk of Tennessee, who just was a big wild card and kind of threw everybody off his game. Now, Clay was close to winning, and if it had not been for abolitionist James G. Birney, he may have. What happened is Birney takes enough votes away from Clay in New Jersey to cost him that state. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Then after that, Henry Clay wants to win again, but he loses the party nomination to Zachary Taylor in 1850. This is when Henry Clay basically decides to retire from public life. He had actually probably suffered a heart attack at some point and, just really wanted to kind of go back. In fact, when he returned home, he gave a great speech and he said, I'd love to keep talking to you, but there's an old woman at Ashland who's been waiting for me. You see, at a certain point, Lucretia Hart stopped coming to Washington. So it was, he probably was pretty lonely. He probably did miss his wife, who he really did seem to love a lot, even though he was kind of a party animal in Washington, D.C. I don't think he ever cheated on his wife. 1850 comes along, and this is another thing we're going to get into kind of as we go further here. But basically, the United States was on the brink of civil war. They needed a compromise, and so Kentucky sent Henry Clay. His poor health forced him to count on Stephen Douglas of Illinois to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But he does come in and give these wonderful speeches to really, get it done. And, like I said, we're going to get to the Compromise of 1850 later, but it does really put off the war. Eventually, he becomes too sick to attend to the Senate. He will die on June 29th, 1852, in a Washington, D.C. hotel room. He will become the first person to ever lie in state in the U.S. Capitol, and he will free his slaves. Now, you might remember when Representative Cummings died this last year, and they talked about how the platform that he had been placed on was the same platform used by Abraham Lincoln. Well, that platform was actually first used for Henry Clay, as he was the first person to actually lie in state. I mentioned before, what they did is after Henry Clay died, they brought his body back to Kentucky via train, stopping in several places. One of the stops was Springfield, Illinois, where Abraham Lincoln did give a eulogy. But the reason I talk about Henry Clay is because he is there this entire period. He is the counter to Andrew Jackson. He is Andrew Jackson's opposition. We will see that as we kind of move forward. That's basically all I have for this particular video. The next video will be kind of our lecture about the Jacksonian era itself. So I will see you all again in the next video.